is Elizabeth Bourne. I am an artist and a photographer, and I've primarily worked most recently with Arctic imagery. One of the first questions people frequently ask me is if they even know where Svalbard is. Otherwise, I usually say go to the top of Greenland and then turn right, and you'll run into Svalbard. I lived in Longyearbyen, which is the world's northernmost town, and it is a town. Svalbard is under Norwegian sovereignty, and this year is a very, very big deal for Svalbard because this is the 100th anniversary of Norway getting sovereignty over Svalbard. Svalbard was originally the last terra nullius, or last place that belonged to no one, and there was no agreement on what was going to happen there. This is a very big deal for Norway, and several members of the royal family will be going to Svalbard for the celebrations for the 100-year anniversary of the Svalbard Treaty. Many people want to know, how did you end up going to Svalbard? That seems like it's a very long way away. It's a very different life. It is. And how I got there was not intentional. I ended up in Svalbard. I had started doing photography after my husband died. My husband died in 2012, and I'd begun doing photography out on walks with the dog. And I was doing more and more, I got more and more interested in photography. Prior to that, I had been primarily a painter, and I had done a number of different kinds of works in painting and also in digital artwork. So I was doing these photographs, and a mentor friend of mine on Facebook said, "Hey, I'm leading a photography exhibition to Greenland and Svalbard. You should come." And I thought, Greenland? I didn't even think about Svalbard. I thought, Greenland? That's so far away. It's so expensive. I don't know. What would I do about it? And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, when will you ever have a chance to go to Greenland again? Just as a side note, I've been to Greenland 4 times, and I will probably go back a fifth time either next year or the year after. I have friends in Greenland now, which I would never have thought I would say. So I said yes. This was in 2017, and we went from Iceland to Greenland, up the east coast of Greenland in a refurbished Russian icebreaker, which was a phenomenal experience all by itself. And then we went across the Bering Sea to the northernmost part of Svalbard, and then down Svalbard to Longyearbyen, and then from Longyearbyen, I went home. And that changed my life because the high Arctic is phenomenal. It is extraordinarily beautiful. The thing that as an artist spoke to me the most is that the light is extraordinary. Unless you are standing in that place, it's very difficult to believe what the quality of the light there can be like. It is a different light than what we experience here, and part of the reason why it's a different light is because it is so far north that the light is hitting that part of the planet at a different angle. I had never seen anything like it, and I fell absolutely in love with it. And my first thought when I returned to Seattle, which is where I was living at the time, was, how do I get back there? I felt I had been bitten by what is often called the Arctic disease. And it is a feeling like you're not alive unless you're in the Arctic. There is an intensity to experiencing the Arctic. There is a lightness that you feel there, which people have been trying to investigate for hundreds of years. Why do some people just fall in love with the Arctic, with this place that is barren and cold and rocky and full, and it's utterly inhospitable? Everyone has different theories. One of the ones that I think is most interesting to me, at least on the beginner level, is that altitude equals latitude. And at 78 north, you're actually at a pretty high altitude. Everyone who gets off the plane in Longyearbyen is smiling. I have never seen anyone get off the plane there who wasn't suddenly hit by a burst of joy in the moment. Very few people are not. And I was talking to a scientist about this, and he said, well, it's because their oxygen levels are changed here. and you get used to it, you become accustomed to it. But when you first get here, it just hits you like a blast, and suddenly you feel bubbly and happy, and everything is great. If you live there long enough, you overcome that. But if you have the Arctic disease, you will always love that place. There is a stanza of a Russian poem in Barentsburg. The poet who wrote it called it the Arctic disease. And what it roughly says is that whenever you are in Moscow, whenever you are in a tea room, when the beautiful flowers of spring bloom, all you can think about is the Arctic trails and the ice and the wind and how you will get back there. And that's basically true. So I had this year of desperately trying to get back to Svalbard. So all signatories of the Svalbard Treaty have the right to live and work on Svalbard. You don't need to have a visa. If you can find a job, find housing, you can go and live on Svalbard, which is not something that you can do in Iceland or in Greenland or in Canada. I've also had people ask me why Svalbard and not Alaska, because you would think Alaska would be a natural move for an American. And I've been to Alaska many times. I've worked in Alaska. Never hit me the same. And I think part of that is I was never as far north. Svalbard is 78 degrees north. That's pretty far above the Arctic Circle, which starts at 66 degrees. The other part is that on Svalbard, there are no indigenous people. There have never been indigenous people there. So, as someone who looks at our complicated history with the indigenous people of our own continent, it felt like a piece of freedom to be in a place that I felt like my interpretation of what I saw was as valid as anybody else's because there was no prior human life on Svalbard. If you go to Svalbard, a lot of people have said that amidst all of the feelings that they have, one of them that is a recurring emotion is, we are not meant to be here. This was not a place that was designed for humans. We could not live there. And Greenland, of course, you have a subsistence lifestyle and a pretty good one that the Greenlandic people have had. You cannot do that on Svalbard. There are two mammals on Svalbard. That is the Arctic fox and the Svalbard reindeer. Both of them are immigrants because they came across the ice to be there. The polar bear is classified as a sea mammal because it lives most of its life on the ice, not on land. And then there are the other sea mammals, which are walrus and the various kinds of seals, and then the whales, which come and go in the summer. But for animals that live there year round, it's just two, the reindeer and the Arctic fox. So it's a very barren place, which also is interesting. When you are that close to the wilderness and the wilderness is a step outside your doorway, you feel the power of nature in a way that we don't feel in most of the places we live here in the US. On Svalbard, you can go outside of town about 5 kilometers and there is nothing and no one, and you're out of connectivity and you are entirely on your own. And it's an amazing feeling. You learn to live in the now. If you go out into nature and you do not pay attention every moment, you could die. It is very dangerous. It's really luck that more people don't die there, particularly in snowmobile season when people are going out on their scooters, which is what Norwegians call snowmobiles, because you are going out into the wilderness and it's beautiful and it's incredible, but unless you know how to read a glacier, you can disappear into a crevasse. It is a place that has a lot of dangers. There are reasons why it is a protected place. I did a residency there, and then I was fortunate because I found a place to live straight away. And I knew that this was the place that was going to inform my artwork for the rest of my life. And I have a very strong sense that in order to really do work about a place, you must know that place. And the way we get to know place is we walk that earth. We experience what the light there is. We experience what the storms are, what the good weather is. We see the animals who come and go. We get into the rhythm of that life. And you get that feeling by walking the earth and by being present in that location. And that to me was extremely important. Daily process is something that as a photographer and as an artist is very important to me also. And what daily process is that every day I would go out and I would photograph. So I have a record of Svalbard from every day from when I moved there to when I left, every single day. And I kept a journal which included my thoughts, my feelings, experiences, and also the weather, the temperature, the conditions, the wind. So it's a pretty complete journal from 2017 to when I left every single day. And I shared that with my friends back here because I also knew that it would be very important to keep a lifeline going with my friends. The way friendships thrive is not in the big moments, it's not at the weddings and the birthdays and the anniversaries. Friendships thrive on the small moments. It's in the little moments that we build friendships and that we build those relationships. And I understood that. And so I would send these journals home to the people who had said they wanted to read them. The first exhibition that I had was actually not painting and it was not traditional photography, and it was a big surprise to me. It came from my love of place and it came from what has been an ongoing desire to try and connect people with the idea that climate change is something that is happening in these places and that because of climate change, these places will change forever. I mean, at least forever as far as we short-lived humans are concerned. It has been an ongoing struggle for me to figure out how to show that. So I was given an opportunity to have this exhibition in Norway, and I asked them, I said, what do you want me to do? And they said, we trust you. Do something about Svalbard, and we believe you'll do something amazing. So, being utterly terrified, I went to an exhibition. I was staying with a friend who was an Arctic guide, and she lived in the UK. And I went into London with her, and I went to the Victoria and Albert, which had just opened up their exhibition on the history of photography. I saw images that are called cyanotypes. They're blue pictures. They are one of the earliest forms of photographic prints. They were developed in 1886. What made them very popular was that you just needed to have these two simple chemicals, a ferric cyanide and a ferric ammonia, mix them together, and you would create this chemical that was light sensitive. Paint that on a piece of paper, expose your negative on this, or some people use them to do photograms and put leaves and plants and things on them. You've probably seen them in art stores. They're called solar prints for children. But you put this negative on it, expose it to sunlight, wash it with water, and you have a photograph. It's going to be blue. It will be that Prussian cyanotype blue, but I thought that's perfect for the Arctic. And what I loved about this process was that cyanotypes, because of their age and place in the history of photography, come with an idea that they are already old, that this is something that is gone. It could be seen as a window to the past. And I wanted to get that sense of history to these modern images to try and express to people how this was fleeting, how this geography, this extraordinary place was changing so fast that it was already in the past, that it was in a way already gone. So that was my first exhibition, and that was in 2018. 2019 and 2020, we all know what happened. We had COVID, and COVID changed everything. I had come back to the US, and while I was here, the first cases of COVID in the US were announced. And it was an extraordinary time. I talked to my son and it's like, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to stay here or what should I do? And he said, go back to Norway. You will be safe in Norway and I cannot take care of you. So I took one of the last planes out of Seattle. It was one of the eeriest moments of my life because all the airports were empty, the airplane was empty. I got to Oslo within hours of when they closed the Norwegian border. They allowed me into Norway because some very good friends of mine came in and said they would be my Norwegian family and would take care of me if I got sick. So I had these very good friends who I will always be grateful to, had to come in and meet with the military because the military was controlling all this and say yes, they would be responsible for me. And I went home with them to quarantine for a month. And then I went back to Svalbard and then ended up quarantining in Svalbard for another 2 weeks. And then Svalbard was closed. No one was allowed to visit for 2 years. The only ones who could come and go were those of us who were residents, were registered residents of Svalbard, which I was. That was a magical time. It was a terrible time for us, for all of humanity. But on Svalbard, it was like we had suddenly found the Garden of Eden because it was only us 2,000 people. We didn't have 100,000 tourists visiting. So you knew everyone in the shop, you knew everyone on the street. You knew everyone if you went out on your snowmobile, and there were very few people there, so there was very few people out there. It was an extraordinary time. From that time came a piece that was called Drift Ice Loss and Change. And that entire piece, it is a 10-meter, 30-foot long piece that was inspired by my flight back to Norway when we flew over the Arctic seas and I could see the sea ice forming in the water and then breaking apart to make new little ice islands and then coming back again and swirling with the currents. It was an extraordinary sight. And I thought, that's it. That is my metaphor for this time, is the sea ice, which is always moving, forming, coming together as we do as humans. And then at the end, it dissolves back into the ocean. It doesn't stay. It's not a permanent phenomena. It is born when it becomes cold enough. It creates these islands and families and groups, and then it splits apart again and it dissolves. And I thought, this is my metaphor for life. This is my metaphor for COVID. This is my metaphor for some of my own personal experiences and journey as I dealt with my grief over my husband's death. This was the perfect subject for me. And I worked on that for almost a year and then had an exhibition with that. And that particular piece, that 10-meter piece, has been shown across Europe. It is a piece that speaks to everyone. I put autobiographical things in it. I also put pieces of my history, every island I've ever lived on, my horse that I had when I was a little girl. A Norwegian friend of mine had a beloved dog who died, and he said, can you put a portrait of Nemo in the ice? And I did. So I know how to find his dog Nemo. So many different things that are personally biographical. But what became very interesting to me was that people would look at this in a way intensely abstracted piece, because it's essentially many, many small dots that swirl and form and create things. It has octopuses and starfish and salmon and images out of the human past. It has all sorts of things if you take the time to sit and look at it. But visitors would see things from their own lives in it. And that was amazing to me, that people would come to it, and if they spent the time looking at it, they would see other things and they were like, oh, how did you paint that reindeer in there? And I'm like, I didn't paint a reindeer in there, but it was something that was iconic for this young woman. And so she saw a reindeer. I had other people who saw, well, that looks like the outline of my hometown. It's like, okay. I had people arguing about whether or not certain conglomerations of the ice that were in there were specific bays and fjords in Norway, because they were certain that they were. They weren't, but they were bringing their own history to this. And I thought that was extremely important. And so that piece has been much loved and that piece has been much exhibited around the world. It has not yet been shown in the US. I would love to show it here. And that started leading me into this exploration of meaning in the Arctic. What does this mean? What does it mean to experience this place? What does this place give to us? And what can we give back to it? And this became the series known as the Arctic Sonata, a series of paintings of glaciers, which I called Sanctuary. And the reason I called it Sanctuary was because I have been fortunate in this experience, in going to this place, in putting myself in this situation and making some of the choices I did to learn how to ride a snowmobile, to learn how to shoot a rifle, to learn how to survive in -30. It put me in a place where I could go and see things that were extraordinary, that I could go into these ice caves in the center of a glacier, that I could spend time on a friend's boat and just spend a day in front of a calving glacier and just watch that glacier. And the feeling that I came from some of these experiences was that one of the things that we get in the Arctic, particularly if we take the time to be quiet and to be there and to be present in that space, is you get the feelings that you used to get in the great cathedrals. When you go into a church to pray, you need solace or you need grace. You would be in that hushed sacred space. You could feel the spirit. And I don't put a name to this. I was raised Roman Catholic, but I have a lot of respect for the multiplicity of people's beliefs. But you can feel the sacred. If you go into a church, you can feel the sacred. If you go and you sit in front of an iceberg, you can feel the sacred. And I wanted to capture that feeling in these paintings so that people would have a sense of the extra natural, that there is a natural world that we're accustomed to. If you look at the greater diversity of nature, that should also be a sacred experience. When I was a little girl, I used to work on a farm. I had a horse. The horse ended up in the drift ice painting. And it always troubled me that the farmer never went to church. And I asked him about this because I was, as you are when you're young and you're arrogant and you think you know everything, I was concerned for the state of his soul. And I said, well, why don't you go to church? And he said, I don't need a church. My church is out here. My church is the woods and the water and the nature that is out here. So that is my church. And that always stayed with me because I think that we can come to nature in a way that is humble and willing to be taught and to see things differently. Part of that feeling was what I wanted to express in the glacier paintings of Sanctuary. That was important to me. The next series, the last one of the Sonata series, was called Modern Martyrs. This is paintings. What I was aiming at with these came from a conversation I had with a friend of mine who had bought one of my photographs of an iceberg in Greenland. And she had loved this photograph. The iceberg was beautiful. It's a good photograph. And she had bought it, and we were talking about it later, and she was saying, "Oh yeah, I, changed the frame. I have it in my living room. Everyone really loves it. I'm so happy with this." And I said, "Oh, that's really great. I'm really happy." I said, and then just without thinking about it, I said, "You know that iceberg's gone." And she just stopped and she looked at me and she said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, think about it. Icebergs only live 2 to 3 years. It's been 4 years since you bought that painting. That iceberg is gone. It's melted into the ocean as icebergs do. They all do this." She was quiet for a minute and she thought, intellectually, I knew that because I know that icebergs go out into the sea and then they drift off and they melt. That's what they do. She said, I intellectually, I understand that. But because I have this image on my wall, it always exists. And that provided the starting point for me to think about how do I get people to think about the fact that these things are leaving, that they are going away, that they're not staying with us. Part of this also was because at that time I was getting very concerned about tourism and specifically the nature of tourism that was happening in the Arctic, where people would come and it seemed frequently like their primary goal was to take a selfie of themselves with a polar bear or with a glacier in the background, and they weren't actually paying attention to the nature around them. They were paying attention to themselves having this experience that they could share with their friends. I don't think they spend a moment really paying attention to where they are because what is important for them is to get images of themselves with that iceberg, that glacier, that walrus, the sled dogs, whatever looks quaint about Longyearbyen to them, and to be posting those to show that they were in this remarkable place. And to me, that was sort of missing the point of what I think people should be going to the Arctic for. I recognize there's a lot of last chance tourism because things are changing fast and they will change even faster. But what the hope always is for the guides and what the companies always say is that they're hoping to engender in the tourists who come a feeling that this place should be protected. I haven't seen any evidence that that actually happens, but I hope it does. Part of what I wanted to do was to give a sense of the icebergs as modern martyrs, and they are martyrs to the Anthropocene, to the things that we have been doing that have sped up climate change. I know there's a big discussion about whether or not there is climate change and how much people contribute to it. Well, in the 7 years I lived in Svalbard, I saw glaciers go from being calving into the sea to being on land. And that is a huge change, and that is extremely fast. And once a glacier is on land, it's rated as a dead glacier because it will not grow. It will only shrink and recede. And I saw that happen. I saw many, many glaciers that had been calving and experiencing the normal life cycle of icebergs and then refreezing became what they call surging glaciers. A surging glacier is moving extremely fast, and in some instances, they are moving feet every day. So the whole notion when you say she drives like a glacier, meaning someone's driving very slowly, it's not really true anymore. You can't say that because some glaciers move very quickly. So I wanted to find some way of expressing this The archipelago of Svalbard is also home to a Russian settlement called Barentsburg, and it used to be home to another Russian settlement called Pyramiden. And it's the only place in the world where Norwegians and Russians cohabit on the same little tiny piece of land like this. It's an extraordinary thing. But I became very interested in the Eastern Orthodox iconography that you could find in Barentsburg. I began to see that as perhaps a way that I could get a sense of the shortness of the lives of these icebergs. And of course, as the icebergs are being calved by the glaciers, the shortening of the lives of the glaciers. So I saw it as doing sort of a modern martyr because they are the martyrs to basically our greed for more and better things, our desire for speed. A lot of the sins of capitalism are expressed in the causes of climate change. And I wanted to try and get that into it. The other major exhibitions that I had while I was there was a series of exhibitions called Glacial Narratives. At this point, I had started getting it back into cyanotypes. I hadn't done them for several years. The piece that I did was a very large, it was a 200-piece cyanotype of the Eki Glacier. The Eki Glacier is one of the world's fastest calving glaciers. It calves every 15 minutes. If you go out there to see it on a boat, don't worry, you're going to see it calve because every 15 minutes it's losing ice and it's dropping ice, and the entire sea around it is covered with icebergs and bobbing ice, and it's a bit of a challenge to get close to it in a boat. It's about 6 feet by 4 feet, so it's very, very large. It's 20 pieces across and it's 10 pieces down. It is built on magnets. And so the intent of this piece was to have pieces that were missing and that were on a side table so that the public could come in and try and put the glacier back together. But there would always be pieces missing because I wanted to sort of drive home the point that you cannot put the glacier back together, that so much has been lost, it will never be what it was. What we can do is we can mitigate, but we cannot restore. We are not God. We lack the power to do that. Climate change is not something that's just happening in the Arctic. It's happening here. It's happening wherever you live. We are experiencing climate change. If we are living in the same place we lived where we grew up, then we know that things have changed because think about what it was like when you grew up and how is it different now. In the Pacific Northwest, where I'm living now, we have vast temperature vacillations that there never used to be. It's really, really hot today. It's a day of 80 degrees. It's May. Should never be this hot. Forest fires, things that never used to happen here. Forest fires because it was always too wet. Now there's a fire season. We didn't used to have that. Every place you go, I mean, I grew up in New England and I remember huge quantities of snow, and they get almost no snow now. They don't get the kind of snows that we had when I was a little girl, and my brothers would go out and build an igloo for me so that I could have a little snow house to play in. You can probably find similar examples if you look at where you grew up or where you're living. It is changing. What we are seeing, what I was seeing in Svalbard was not only the destruction of these beautiful glaciers and the changes there, but it was also what was happening to the sea life. More and more seals are losing their pups because they're having more and more spring storms and the ice isn't stable. So the mother will have to leave and go get food, and the pup will be blown off the ice and it will drown because it's not old enough to be able to support itself. Polar bear pups, a very common thing. If a mother is nice and healthy and fat, she'll have two cubs. If she is not nice and healthy and fat, her body reabsorbs the fetuses. But what we're having now is that cubs who are starving to death once they're born because their mothers cannot find enough food for them. They will sacrifice the cubs for their own lives because, of course, they can have another cub, and that's nature is cruel, but that is happening. We're seeing all of this kind of loss and changes, fish that are moving up and are becoming predatory who never used to be able to live in the Arctic, but because the waters are warming, they're coming up and they're taking over environmental niches that used to belong to another creature, but that creature lives in a much more fragile and restricted environment. These are changes that are happening and they're happening quickly and they're happening because of our choices that we make and how we're living our lives, because we want to buy a new car every 3 years made in Asia because they're more fashionable and then we just throw them out. So it's the waste that is involved in how we're choosing to live our lives is horrifying, and it is affecting the rest of the world in a variety of different ways. This year, in 2025, I moved back to the US. I had lived in Svalbard for 7 years. During the time that I was gone, my son got a job, got a wife, and has a baby. He had been talking to me for over a year that I needed to come home and do my job as a grandmother. I feel very strongly we have a duty of family, and it was like, yeah, but not yet, but not yet. My contract with the town ended in November of last year. And so it was like, okay, I will leave in 2025. My granddaughter is 3.5. She's adorable. And now I am back here. I'm still working. I have a studio and I am trying to be a grandmother as well as an artist. And that is my new job. So that is basically my long story of my life on Svalbard.